Yes, it's marginally still good morning, ladies and gentlemen, not afternoon yet. First of all, I'll be speaking in English because a lot of the terminology we're using today, especially with the issues which Panos used earlier, is basically more in English. I think also because I've got our fellow speakers here, Mr. Grimaldi and Mr. Dreyfus earlier, and of course Mr. Raskaridis, who over the years have enlightened me because I've just began my career by me having the privilege of being on the board of EXA. So through the wisdom of these people, I've learned a lot. And Mr. Mitropoulos, I thank you also very much for making the comments you made earlier. But as I'm still on a learning curve. I'd like to thank ΝΑΥΤΕΜΠΟΡΙΚΗ for actually inviting me to present today. In fact, they put this conference in a sandwich. We've got the Davis, the Global Summit venue, which is taking place in Davos. From what I gather, there's about 2,500 people attending. And then also, we've got the other issue where we've got our beloved Donald Trump, who's taking up the presidency of the United States tomorrow. Now, as you all know, Mr. Trump has been fairly colorful in his remarks, and he's also been fairly colorful in the way he dresses. He seems to have this peculiar habit of wearing his tie further down, and we don't really know whether we question whether it's there to protect or to portray. We have a Swiss banker who's a friend of mine who told me it could actually also act as a bulletproof vest, but I'm not quite sure about that. The reason why I mention and I'm highlighting the presidency of the United States is because one thing which we have a major issue with the future, which we have to confront altogether in the future, is that Mr. Trump has already referred to the greenhouse emissions as being a hoax. Now, that's probably a little bit patronizing, to say the least, when you see the effort which is made by so many of us here and who are so involved in protecting our environment. We can't sit back and make remarks of that caliber, and which is, say, intimidating, to say the least, and refer to the emissions issue as being a hoax. And that is one thing which I must say, I know that Mr. Trump has been fairly colorful in many of his approaches, but that's one thing which I take exception to. In our field, we've got basic three issues which concern us concerning the environment, main issues. And I won't repeat myself in detail because Mr. Raskaridis has already got into them in the headlines anyway. We've got the CO2 emissions, we've got the ballast water system terms, and we also have the laws about sulfur. Now, those issues, beginning with the ballast water system, I think that basically is perhaps what I'd refer to as a can of worms. Inconsistency, different regulations. The US Coast Guard has come up with regulations which are somewhat differ from those given by the guideline of the IMO. That's also been correlated with the situation of not having deadlines but giving postponements for dry docks. And the reason why I want to mention that particular point is because many of you in this room today, especially with the market being at the state it is, are perhaps on the verge of actually going out to acquire ships. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we don't really know what the cost could be envisaged when you're thinking about even an ordinary Kamsarmax, so say an 80,000 tonner with built in the after 2010, 2012. You don't know where that situation, what the magnitude of the cost one would be involved in actually converting to the water ballast treatment system, because basically it's still a big mystery to date. So I would just alert you and caution those of you in the room who, especially ones the younger generation, to just be alert and be cautious about the expenditure which you may incur in just handling that issue alone. CO2 emissions, another area of inconsistency and perhaps misinformation. A few years ago, the transportation by sea was an annual figure, I think in the region of about 9.5, 10 billion tons. The cargo carried, when you compare with the aviation, and the reason why I'm comparing with the aviation is because Richard Branson years ago, through a company which he referred to as the Carbon War Room, came down like a ton of bricks and said that all we people involved in the shipping industry have got no real sensitivity or concern about the environment. But he got it all wrong, because when you compare the 9 billion or 9.5 billion tons of cargo which has been transported within the shipping industry, and compare with the 48 million tons of cargo which is conveyed or transported in the aviation industry, you've got a comparison here of, I think, about 600 million tons worth of CO2 emissions referred to in the shipping sector versus, I think, 400 million tons or 450 million tons in the aviation industry. So, ladies and gentlemen, isn't it a bit unfair to sit back and come down like a ton of bricks on the shipping industry when comparing with the aviation alone, when you've got 10 billion tons of cargo on one hand, 48 million tons on the other hand, and yet the comparison between the CO2 emissions are basically almost compatible. On the element of sulfur, another can of worms. There's a view, a technical view, and I don't purport to be technically minded, which says the following: that the process in converting fuel to low sulfur fuel produces more emissions than the fuel in its original state. So effectively, putting it mildly, ladies and gentlemen, we may be cutting our nose to spite our face. If you go through the process of having the sulfur reduction regulations, and in doing so you're producing a worse carbon greenhouse effect in the industry, what is the purpose of going to the expenditure and the aggravation of having the sulfur reduction? Secondly, again, it's perhaps more of a technical point, which perhaps people can comment on afterwards during our debate, is that distillates, the ships actually, when you try to use distillates to reduce the sulfur content, that has the risk of causing a damaging effect to the engine, because it's what I gather, it's a technical process which is fairly difficult. And only in Los Angeles alone, I understand that, or outside the vicinity of Los Angeles, the immobilized ships which are approaching port are about 4- or 5-fold. So there you have the element of accident, which obviously results in the element of danger, of having a casualty, which ultimately, taken as, say, a VLCC, you've got the horrific case of pollution. I'm going to be short, Mr. Dobbs, because I think we've got a bit of a time restraint as well. Basically, the other thing I want to mention is that at the end of the day, the authority of the IMO just should not be challenged. We're not in a position to be able to have any kind of consistency in maintaining regulations, which I think we all in the shipping industry are much more sensitive and proactive than people purport to be. And I think Mr. Dreyfus mentioned earlier that perhaps our fault in the shipping industry is should we come out in the front, go on the front line, and explain to the politicians what we're doing. I actually took the liberty earlier, a few days ago, it was a bit of a short notice, of actually inviting to our conference Christine Berg from the European Union, because I feel that with the situation, with the way it is now, which is fairly volatile, the only way we can actually bridge the gap is through communication, through asking questions, through seeing the progressive elements which are actually being adapted every day. And as our predecessor mentioned about Darwin, I mean, the idea is that the strongest person is not the one who's powerful or the one who's more educated or conversant or knowledgeable, but the person who can adapt to change. And this is what we have to more or less focus in adapting to. Last but not least, being Greek, I want to refer to our 5,000 years of history. I want to refer to the fact that, and this is not my quote, it's Mr. Nikki Papadakis, who's a beloved friend of mine, that the whole strength of Greece is our future generation. And last but not least, let's not all forget, ladies and gentlemen, that money talks, but wealth whispers. Thank you very much.